They called him worthless, until the CEO saw his face. It was a night filled with laughter and shimmering lights, a celebration of success held in the grand marble lobby of one of the most powerful tech companies in Austin. The executives arrived in sleek black suits and designer dresses, sipping champagne and exchanging congratulations as they looked out over the city skyline. A live jazz band played softly in the background, blending perfectly with the clinking of glasses and the hum of polite conversation. It was a picture of wealth, status, and power. But just beyond the glitz and gold, tucked in the shadows where no one bothered to look, stood a man who most had never even noticed. Walter Jenkins, a janitor in his late 60s, moved quietly along the edge of the room. His uniform was clean but worn at the collar, and his old hands gripped the mop handle with the same steady strength he had used for years. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He never interrupted. And tonight, like every other night, he did his job without drawing attention to himself. While the upper floors of the building sparkled with innovation and investment deals, Walter mopped up spilled wine and discarded napkins, the mess left behind by those who never thought twice about who cleaned up after them. As the night went on, a group of younger executives grew louder with each drink. They were new to the company, rising stars. They called themselves fresh MBAs with sharp tongues and sharper egos. One of them, a man named Todd, noticed Walter mopping near the entrance and smirked, with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been humbled. He elbowed his friends and gestured toward the janitor. "Bet he doesn't even have a high school diploma." Todd chuckled under his breath, loud enough for a few others to hear. "Wonder if he knows we make more in a week than he makes all year." The laughter that followed was quiet, but cutting. Walter didn't flinch. He had heard worse. Still, something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way they watched him, like he didn't belong in the same room. Or maybe it was the phone one of them pulled out, recording a short clip, while another mimed sweeping like a clown behind him. They thought it was harmless fun, a joke, just another forgettable moment in a forgettable night. But not for Walter. He looked up only once, just for a second. His eyes met Todd's, and in that single glance, something shifted. Not in Todd, but in the young woman standing behind him. Her name was Emily, one of the newer hires in marketing. She had seen Walter every morning, quietly emptying the trash near her desk, always with a small nod and a soft good morning. And now, seeing him mocked like this, something in her twisted. She stepped forward, hesitant but firm. "That's enough," she said, not loudly but clearly. The laughter stopped. Todd turned to her, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Relax, Emily. It's a party." He doesn't care. But Walter had already turned away, continuing his work like nothing had happened. Still, Emily's words hung in the air longer than the music. And for the first time that night, a few eyes followed Walter as he moved quietly toward the side exit. He never looked back. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Walter arrived at work like he always did, an hour early, while the city still slept. The lobby was littered with confetti and half-empty glasses, evidence of the night before. He worked methodically, silently, cleaning up after those who had laughed at him just hours earlier. And then, as he wrung out the mop for the last time, the front doors opened. Grace Holloway, the CEO of the company, walked in earlier than expected. She paused at the sight of the elderly janitor in the lobby, squinting slightly as she stepped closer. And then, recognition dawned across her face. She knew that face. She remembered it, not from the janitorial staff list, but from something far deeper, more important. Her footsteps slowed as she whispered, almost to herself, "Walter Jenkins." Walter looked up slowly. There was no bitterness in his eyes, no anger, just a calm acceptance, and perhaps a trace of something else, something deeper. Grace stared at him, frozen in place, and in that moment, everything changed. The man they had laughed at, the man they had filmed, the man they called worthless. He wasn't just a janitor. He was someone far more important than any of them could have imagined. For the rest of that morning, the office slowly came alive. Coffee brewing, keyboards clacking, footsteps echoing off glass walls. But there was something different in the air. A hush, a quiet tension that hadn't been there the day before. Word had started to spread about what happened at the gala, about the janitor, about the strange look on the CEO's face when she said his name. Grace Holloway spent the morning in her office, blinds closed, barely touching her coffee. Her assistants noticed. So did the department heads. She canceled her meetings. She stared at her computer screen, but her mind was elsewhere, years away, decades even back to when she was a struggling graduate student trying to hold on to her future with both hands. Back then, she had nearly dropped out of her master's program. Tuition had gone up, her father had gotten sick, and every scholarship she applied for seemed to slip through her fingers. It was in that chaos, in that near collapse, that someone had stepped in, a soft-spoken professor, older than most, with kind eyes and a quiet voice. He taught one of the toughest courses in the program, but he had seen something in her, something no one else had noticed. He helped her rewrite her thesis. He gave her part-time work in his lab. And when it still wasn't enough, he handed her an envelope one afternoon with just 5 words written on a flap. Don't let go. Keep going. Inside was a check. Enough to cover her tuition. Enough to stay afloat. She never forgot that moment. But what she had never known, until now, was what happened to him after that. Professor Walter Jenkins. A name she hadn't said out loud in almost 20 years. A name that had once meant everything. She opened the company's employee records, scrolled past engineers, analysts, regional leads. Finally, at the bottom of the facility's management list, she found him. Walter Jenkins, night janitor. Hired, March 2017. No title, no accolades, no degrees. Just a short line, assigned to lobby floors 1 to 3. That afternoon, while the rest of the company kept pretending everything was normal, Grace walked down to the basement level where the janitorial lockers were. It smelled like bleach and concrete. A small radio was playing jazz in the corner. Walter sat at a metal table, slowly eating a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, like she was an old friend dropping by for coffee. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said gently, as if he had expected her all along. She didn't know what to say at first. So many questions tangled together. Why hadn't he said anything? Why was he working here? Why like this? He motioned for her to sit, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was warm, not awkward. Finally, Walter leaned back, his eyes soft. "I never wanted the spotlight," he said. "Not then. Not now. I just wanted to keep working quietly." "But you were one of the original engineers," Grace said, her voice almost breaking. "You helped build the first prototype, the one that landed the company its first investor." Walter nodded. "Yes, I was proud of that, but I left not long after." Grace had heard whispers, rumors among the older staff, that one of the original developers had vanished after a tragedy, that he'd walked away from millions in equity. She had never connected that story to the man mopping her floors. "I lost my son," Walter said quietly. "Cancer. He was only 16. Grace's heart cracked. After that, I didn't want to code anymore. I didn't want to build things that didn't matter. I didn't want to sit in meetings where people argued about revenue projections while my world was crumbling. So I stepped away. I needed something simpler." She stared at him, tears threatening to surface. "But why this?" she asked. "Why come back here at all?" Walter looked down at his hands. "Because I wanted to stay close to the thing I helped build. Not for glory. Just to know it was still standing." There was so much dignity in his voice. No resentment. No bitterness. Only a quiet kind of peace. It made Grace feel ashamed. Not because of anything she had done, but because of what others had. "You should have said something," she whispered. "About who you were. About what you'd done." Walter shook his head. "If I had to say it, then it wasn't worth saying." Grace didn't sleep that night. She replayed everything. The way the executives had laughed, the video she had seen, the look in Walter's eyes when he told her he just wanted to keep working quietly. The man who had given so much, asked for nothing, and still showed up every morning with pride in his work. And she made a decision. By the end of that week, everything would change, not just for Walter, but for the entire company. They had forgotten where they came from. But now, they were going to remember. By Monday morning, whispers had turned into questions. There was an uneasiness floating through the halls, something invisible but heavy, like the air before a storm. Some employees sensed in the way the CEO walked past without her usual small talk. Others noticed the way Emily from marketing had stopped laughing with her team, choosing instead to sit quietly at her desk, eyes distant, like she was replaying something she regretted. Then the email arrived. A mandatory company-wide meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp in the main conference hall. No agenda, no explanation, just a single subject line, a reminder of who we are. They came slowly at first, thinking it would be a regular corporate update, another round of performance metrics, maybe a new product reveal. But when they stepped inside and saw the massive screen already lowered and Grace Holloway standing silently at the podium, no notes in hand, they knew this was something else entirely. She waited until the room was full, waited until the last of the department heads had taken their seats, including Todd, who strolled in confidently, still smirking from the weekend's festivities. Without a word, she clicked the remote in her hand. The screen lit up. A shaky phone video began to play. At first, there was confusion, then recognition, then silence. They watched as the screen showed Walter, mopping quietly near the lobby entrance. They heard the off-camera laughter, Todd's voice, the mocking, the cruelty dressed up as comedy. And finally, the worst part, the fake sweeping, the exaggerated mimicry, and the smug look of entitlement on the faces of those who thought they were untouchable. No one said a word. When the video ended, Grace looked up. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, stopping briefly on Todd, who had gone pale. "This man," she began, voice firm but steady, "has worked in this building for 8 years. He comes in early. He stays late. He knows every corner of these walls better than any of you. And last Friday night, several of our leaders, our supposed examples of excellence, decided to humiliate him for the crime of doing his job." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others stared down at their laps, ashamed. What you didn't know, what many of you forgot, is that Walter Jenkins is not just a janitor. She paused. He is one of the founding engineers of this company. 30 years ago, when all we had was a dream and a prototype, Walter was the one who kept us grounded. He helped build the code that got us our first investor. He mentored me when I had nothing but a secondhand laptop and a pile of rejection letters. And when tragedy struck his family, he walked away, not because he gave up, but because he chose something more important. And even then, years later, he returned not to reclaim glory, but to quietly serve the very people who forgot his name. You could hear a pin drop. She turned to face the leadership row. "Todd Williams, effective immediately. You are suspended pending full review. Anyone else who took part in Friday's incident will meet with HR this afternoon. No exceptions." She turned back to the room. But this isn't just about one video. This is about what we value, about the culture we've allowed to take root. Somewhere along the way, we stopped looking people in the eye. We stopped asking about their stories. We built glass offices and left humility at the door. There was no applause, no cheers, just stillness, the kind that happens when people realize they've been blind. That afternoon, Walter didn't mop the floors. Instead, he was invited to the top floor, the executive suite. For the first time since the building was constructed, Grace met him at the elevator. No press, no fanfare, just a quiet handshake and a simple, "It's good to see you again." She offered him a formal role as senior ethics advisor, a desk if he wanted it, a voice in culture decisions, a chance to help steer the company's soul back on course. But Walter only smiled. "I appreciate that," he said. "But all I ever wanted was for people to treat each other like they matter." So instead, Grace offered him something else, something more personal, a new mentorship program named after Walter's late son, Daniel, a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth who wanted to study engineering, just like his boy had dreamed of doing. And Walter, for the first time in a long time, felt seen, not for what he used to be, but for who he still was. By the end of the week, the company began changing. The mentorship program launched. A training series on dignity and leadership replaced the usual cold onboarding sessions. And Walter, he went back to mopping some mornings, not because he had to, but because he liked the quiet, the rhythm, the simplicity. But now, people stopped to greet him. They offered coffee. They remembered his name. Because sometimes it takes the smallest man in the room to remind everyone how to stand tall. The building felt different now. Not because of the polished glass or the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the halls each morning, not because of new policies or plaques on the wall, but because people had begun to look each other in the eye again, to slow down, to say thank you. There was a softness in the air, a kind of reverence that hadn't been there before, not for titles, but for people. Walter still came in early, as he always had. The mop still squeaked softly across the marble floors in the lobby, but now there were pauses, small ones, just long enough for someone to stop and say, "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins." And he always smiled back, genuine, humble, as though none of this had ever been about him. But it had been. The story had spread, not just through the company, but beyond. A local paper picked it up first. From engineer to janitor, the man who chose silence. Then came a short interview on public radio. And soon, an article on a national business magazine's front page, his photograph beneath a bold headline. The founder no one knew. When asked why he never told anyone, Walter answered simply, "Because value isn't something you shout. It's something you show." The scholarship named after his son, the Daniel Jenkins Fellowship, received hundreds of applications in its first month. Bright young minds from underserved communities, many of whom had once believed they would never step foot in university, now had a path forward because of a man they'd never met and a boy who had dreamed of building machines that helped the world. Each week, Walter would review the applications personally, sitting in a quiet room on the 12th floor, where they'd finally given him a badge that opened more than just a janitor's closet. He read each letter like it was sacred, circling names and writing notes in the margins. It wasn't about grades. It was about heart. Grace Holloway often joined him, sitting across the table with a warm cup of tea and a shared silence that didn't need to be filled. Sometimes they'd talk about the future. Other times, they'd say nothing at all. Just two people who had once been teacher and student, now equals, bound by a story the world almost forgot. As for Todd and the others who had mocked Walter that night, most were gone now, either by resignation or quiet release. A few remained, changed by the weight of their own shame. One of them, months later, approached Walter near the elevator, head bowed, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I did, for not seeing you." Walter didn't scold. He didn't look away. He just nodded and replied, "It's not too late to start." And somehow, that felt like forgiveness. The company's culture shifted in more ways than one. The phrase "dignity first" became more than a campaign. It became a quiet mantra whispered in boardrooms and break rooms alike. New hires were no longer just trained on strategy and software, but on humanity. They were told the story of Walter Jenkins during orientation, not as a legend, but as a lesson. Respect isn't earned by position. It's earned by presence. 1 year after the gala incident, the company held a very different kind of gathering. Not in a ballroom, but outside, in the courtyard garden that Walter had helped design decades ago. There were no champagne towers, no red carpets, just rows of folding chairs, soft music, and a plaque unveiled beneath the shade of a flowering tree. It read, "In honor of Walter Jenkins, engineer, teacher, janitor, mentor, the quiet force behind our foundation." When Walter stepped up to say a few words, he didn't bring a speech. He never liked attention. But he looked out at the crowd, employees, students, journalists, even old colleagues who had flown in from across the country, and cleared his throat. "I was never looking for recognition," he began. "I just wanted to work with purpose, to leave things a little better than I found them." He paused. "But along the way, I learned that sometimes dignity isn't about standing tall in the spotlight. It's about staying upright in the shadows." The audience rose to their feet, not because it was expected, but because it was deserved. And in that moment under the sun, surrounded by blooming life and humbled hearts, Walter Jenkins, the janitor, the engineer, the man, stood quietly at the center of a world he had helped shape, not with wealth or words, but with wisdom and a mop. Because sometimes the greatest legacies are not built with noise. They're built with grace and the courage to keep showing up even when no one is watching. In modern life, it's easy to judge others based on appearances, job titles, or income. But the story of Walter Jenkins reminds us that human dignity isn't defined by status. It's defined by how we live, how we work, and how we treat others. A person can dedicate their entire life quietly, without seeking recognition, and often it's those very people who leave the deepest mark. We should never look down on anyone just because they seem beneath us. Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. So choose kindness, choose to listen, choose to see beyond the surface. That's how we create a more just, compassionate world. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video to spread its positive message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful, uplifting stories. We tell stories not just to entertain, but to remind the world that dignity is a basic right for everyone.